Today, what we are witnessing at this moment in history is not just a headline or a fleeting piece of breaking news. It is a turning point. The moment the Yemeni drones reached their targets deep inside Israel with such stunning accuracy, the world saw something it could not unsee: the balance of power in the Middle East shifting before our very eyes. This was not merely about military hardware, nor was it simply a matter of geopolitics. It was a statement, a declaration that technology, resilience, and willpower can level the playing field in ways we once thought impossible. And that, my friends, is what makes this moment both terrifying and extraordinary. When we speak of technological breakthroughs in warfare, most minds immediately go to the great military powers: the United States, Israel, Russia, or China. These are the nations we associate with innovation, with billion-dollar research budgets, with state-of-the-art laboratories producing weapons meant to secure global dominance. And yet, the moment Yemeni drones reached their targets deep inside Israel with such remarkable accuracy, that entire narrative cracked. It was a moment that forced the world to rethink what we believed about technology, power, and who holds the keys to shaping the future of war. Now, let's pause on that, because here lies the hook. How does a nation battered by years of blockade, strangled by sanctions, and written off by the global order suddenly emerge as the architect of one of the most precise and shocking strikes of our time? That's not just a military achievement, it's a historical disruption. It shows us that innovation does not always sprout from abundance. Sometimes it is born from desperation, from necessity, and from the sheer will to overcome impossible odds. Consider Israel's defenses for a moment. The Iron Dome, the pride of its military strategy, is backed and financed by the United States. It has been marketed worldwide as an impenetrable shield, the gold standard of defense technology, a system designed to intercept and neutralize any incoming threat. Billions of dollars poured into research, testing, and deployment have created an aura of invincibility around it. And yet, these Yemeni drones slipped through, not once, not twice, but in multiple waves, hitting their targets with precision. That should give us pause, because if a system backed by the world's largest military power can be bypassed by drones built on a fraction of the cost, then what does that say about the future of warfare? What does that say about the credibility of these so-called unbreakable shields? The lesson is stark. Technological innovation is no longer the exclusive property of wealthy nations. We are entering a new era where the underdog has tools that can pierce the armor of giants. This is the age of democratized warfare, where the cost of entry is no longer measured in billions but in ingenuity, persistence, and determination. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a paradigm shift of historic proportions. Think of the broader implications. For decades, arms manufacturers and defense contractors have sold the idea that safety comes with higher budgets, that the more you spend, the safer you are. Governments, in turn, pour astronomical sums into weapons programs, believing that money alone buys security. But here, Yemen proves that this is no longer true. A nation under siege, with a fraction of the resources, has managed to develop drones capable of bypassing billion-dollar defense networks. If that does not make you question the very foundation of modern military doctrine, I don't know what will. And here is the uncomfortable reality. This technological breakthrough in Yemen will not stay in Yemen. Every strategist, every resistance movement, every government watching this unfold is already taking notes. They are studying the flight patterns, the designs, the cost efficiency, and they are asking themselves, if Yemen can do this, why not us? And that question is the true nightmare for the established powers, because once the technology is proven, it spreads. Once the myth of invulnerability is broken, it cannot be restored. Let us be clear, this is not just about drones hitting targets. This is about the collapse of old assumptions. It is about the sobering recognition that the world has changed, that the monopoly on military power is gone, and that new players now have access to tools once thought unimaginable for them. It is about the fear that the walls protecting the powerful are no longer as high or as strong as they believed. And I ask you to reflect on this. What happens when the powerless suddenly have the means to strike at the heart of the powerful? What happens when those dismissed as weak prove they can shape the battlefield in ways the mighty never anticipated? That is the hook, the hard question. And the Yemeni drones, flying across deserts and borders, answered it with stunning clarity. They told us that in the 21st century, technological breakthroughs will not be defined by who spends the most, but by who dares the most. And that realization should unsettle every capital, every defense ministry, every general who thought they understood the future of war. When the news broke that Yemeni drones had penetrated deep into Israeli airspace and struck their intended targets with astonishing precision, the political and psychological impact was immediate. This was not just another episode in a long and painful conflict. No, this was something far more profound, a shock to the national psyche of Israel, a shock to the carefully crafted image of invulnerability that has been presented to the world for decades. Because what does it mean when a nation that prides itself on one of the most advanced security systems in the world suddenly finds that system pierced, not by another great military power, but by one of the poorest and most embattled nations on earth? That question alone is enough to ignite political storms inside and outside Israel. The hook here is undeniable. Power depends as much on perception as it does on reality. Israel's security narrative has always been built not just on military might, but on the projection of absolute superiority. The Iron Dome, the layered missile defense systems, the intelligence networks, all of these were meant to cultivate an image that nothing could touch Israel without being intercepted, neutralized, or destroyed. That image has been shaken, and once an image of invulnerability cracks, it does not simply repair itself. It lingers in the minds of citizens, in the calculations of adversaries, and in the debates of allies. Within Israel, this psychological tremor manifests as fear and uncertainty. If drones from Yemen can reach the heart of Israeli territory, then what else is possible? Families who once trusted the Iron Dome to protect them now question its effectiveness. Political leaders, who built their reputations on promises of security, now face critics demanding accountability. The public discourse shifts from confidence to anxiety, and in politics, anxiety is a dangerous force. It erodes trust, it destabilizes governments, and it fuels opposition movements. But the shock does not stop at Israel's borders. It reverberates through Washington, where billions of dollars have been poured into funding Israeli defense systems. American taxpayers are now left to ask, what exactly are we financing if these defenses cannot prevent a breakthrough by low-cost drones? In Europe, where governments often rely on Israeli defense technology, defense ministers must now reassess their procurement strategies. Can they continue to market systems that the world just witnessed fail in real time? The credibility crisis spreads like wildfire, and it is not easily contained. The psychological dimension also extends to Israel's adversaries. What they see is not just a military success by Yemen, but proof of vulnerability. And vulnerability is the great equalizer. It emboldens movements, it strengthens morale, and it changes calculations. For years, Israel's adversaries may have hesitated, believing that any attempt to strike would be futile against superior defenses. Now, with Yemen's demonstration, that hesitation weakens. The battlefield is no longer defined by certainty of Israeli dominance, but by the possibility of Israeli exposure. This is the dangerous part of psychological warfare. Once the idea of weakness takes root, it spreads faster than any missile. Perceptions turn into strategies, and strategies turn into actions. And let us not forget, the very essence of warfare is not only to destroy the enemy's resources, but to destroy the enemy's confidence. In that sense, these drone strikes achieved something far larger than physical damage. They eroded the confidence of a nation and its allies. The political consequences of this erosion are vast. Inside Israel, opposition parties seize the moment to question leadership. They ask, how could this happen? Why were defenses not adequate? Who is accountable? These questions fuel political crises, and political crises, in turn, weaken governments' ability to govern effectively. In international politics, allies may hesitate to commit fully, doubting the reliability of a partner that appears less invincible than it claimed to be. And adversaries, they are already calculating their next move, armed with the knowledge that even the strongest armor has cracks. So let me leave you with this pressing thought. Wars are not only fought with weapons, but with perceptions. And perceptions, once shattered, cannot simply be restored by speeches or promises. The Yemeni drones did not just hit their physical targets, they struck at the very psychological foundation of Israeli security doctrine. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is what makes this moment historic, because when fear replaces confidence, when doubt replaces certainty, the entire political landscape begins to shift, and in that shifting ground lies the possibility of a new and unpredictable future. When analysts describe asymmetrical warfare, they often define it as the strategy of the weak against the strong. It is the approach of those who cannot match their opponent in numbers, in resources, or in sheer firepower, but who find ways to turn weakness into advantage. And yet, the Yemeni drone strikes on Israel did more than illustrate asymmetrical warfare, they redefined it. They showed us that the boundaries between strength and weakness are no longer where we thought they were. That is the real lesson, and it is one that sends chills through the halls of power everywhere. Let us begin with a question, the hook that forces us to reflect. How is it that a nation under siege, deprived of resources, facing relentless airstrikes and sanctions, managed to bypass the defenses of a nation armed with some of the most advanced systems in the world? That is not just clever strategy, that is a new chapter in military history. It proves that asymmetry today is not simply about fighting differently, it is about rewriting the very rules of what warfare looks like. Traditionally, asymmetrical warfare relied on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and improvised attacks. It relied on mobility and unpredictability to frustrate a larger, more organized enemy. But what we saw with the Yemeni drones was something far more sophisticated. We saw technology applied to asymmetry. We saw small, cost-effective devices, sometimes costing only a few $1,000s, achieve what billion-dollar missile defense systems could not prevent. Think about that for a moment, a fraction of the cost, a fraction of the resources, producing an outsized impact that shakes entire nations. That is the power of asymmetry in the modern world. Israel's military, like many powerful nations, is structured on the assumption that superior firepower guarantees control. Air dominance, advanced radar, missile interceptors, all of these are designed to maintain overwhelming superiority. But asymmetrical warfare thrives by finding the blind spots, and drones, with their small size, low cost, and adaptability, have become the perfect tool for this purpose. They are not bound by traditional calculations of power. They do not require massive factories or endless budgets. They only require ingenuity, determination, and the willingness to think beyond conventional limits. Here lies another hook. What happens when innovation no longer flows downward from the powerful to the powerless, but upward from the desperate to the dominant? That reversal is precisely what makes asymmetrical warfare so terrifying to the powerful. Because once it is proven that low-cost innovation can outperform high-cost defense, the entire architecture of military dominance begins to crumble. And the Yemeni strikes proved it with brutal clarity. But this is not only about Yemen and Israel. This lesson travels across borders. Movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are all watching. Governments, too, are watching. They are seeing that the age of asymmetry has entered a new phase, one in which technology is the great equalizer. No longer is it enough to build massive arsenals or stockpile advanced fighter jets. No longer is it enough to rely on nuclear deterrence or economic sanctions, because a determined movement with the right tools and strategies can inflict damage disproportionate to its size, forcing the mighty to confront their vulnerability. And this raises the deepest question of all. If asymmetry has now moved into the technological domain, what does the future of war look like? Are we entering an age where wars are not decided by who has the largest military, but by who has the smartest engineers, the most adaptable strategies, the most relentless will? That, my friends, is not science fiction. It is happening before our eyes. Yemen's drones have rewritten the calculus, and every strategist in every capital knows it. What the Yemeni drone strikes revealed is that asymmetry is not a weakness. It is a strategy of transformation. It is the ability to take what seems like a disadvantage and turn it into an unanswerable strength. And it is this very strategy that shakes the foundations of global security doctrines. Because the truth is, the powerful now live with a new fear that their overwhelming advantage can be undermined by the underestimated, the overlooked, the dismissed. And once that fear takes hold, the dynamics of war, politics, and power are changed forever. The moment Yemeni drones pierced deep into Israeli territory with precision strikes, the impact was not confined to the Middle East. It sent ripples through the global stage, ripples that reached Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Riyadh, and beyond. Because when we talk about geopolitics, we are not talking about isolated incidents. We are talking about how every action in one corner of the world reshapes the calculations of powers everywhere else. This was not just a local strike, it was a message that reverberated across continents, and that, perhaps, is what makes it so consequential. Here is the hook we cannot ignore. If Yemen, under blockade, under pressure, with limited resources, can achieve this level of military innovation and accuracy, then what does that say to the rest of the world? What does it say to nations that already feel constrained or cornered by larger powers? The answer is unsettling. It says that the monopoly of military superiority, once held by superpowers, is no longer guaranteed. It says that the rules of global dominance are changing, and they are changing fast. Let us begin with Washington. For decades, the United States has positioned itself as the guarantor of security for Israel. Billions of dollars in military aid flow annually, justified by the argument that Israel remains the bulwark of American interests in the Middle East. But when Yemeni drones hit their targets despite those billions, American policymakers are forced into uncomfortable questions. How can they continue to defend the efficiency of the defense systems they financed? How can they justify the endless flow of money when those systems prove fallible? And perhaps most dangerous for them, how long before the American public begins to question not just the aid to Israel, but the broader assumption that U.S. military technology can ensure global security, shift the lens to Moscow and Beijing? For them, this moment is not only about military lessons, but also about opportunity. Russia, already engaged in conflicts where drones and asymmetrical strategies play a role, sees in Yemen a case study, a model that can be adapted, studied, and perhaps even exported. China, on the other hand, views it through the prism of strategy and balance of power. If American-backed systems can be bypassed by cheap innovation, then the credibility of U.S. military dominance weakens. That weakening creates openings for Beijing to expand its influence, for Moscow to challenge Western dominance more boldly. In geopolitics, perception is power, and the perception of U.S. vulnerability is a prize neither Russia nor China will ignore. Regional powers, too, are recalibrating. In Tehran, these strikes are seen as validation, proof that resistance movements armed with determination and creativity can destabilize even the most advanced opponents. For Saudi Arabia, however, the implications are far more troubling. Riyadh, already targeted by similar drone attacks in the past, cannot ignore the fact that Israel, supposedly the model of defense, proved penetrable. What then does that mean for Saudi defenses? What does it mean for their reliance on U.S. systems and their security guarantees? The Yemeni drones in striking Israel also struck at the heart of Saudi confidence. And then there is Europe, European states, many of which purchase Israeli defense technologies, suddenly find themselves questioning the reliability of what they are buying. The Iron Dome and other Israeli innovations have long been marketed as near impenetrable. Now, those same systems stand exposed. If Europe cannot trust in the shield they have invested in, how must they rethink their own security doctrines? How must NATO adapt to a reality where even the best technology can be outmaneuvered by low-cost alternatives? The larger hook here is this: geopolitics is not only about who wins on the battlefield, but about who learns the lessons fastest. Yemen's drone strike was not simply a demonstration of military capability, it was a demonstration of possibility. It showed that innovation and determination can upend the global order. And every nation is now asking, how do we prepare for this new era? How do we ensure that we are not the next ones caught off guard? What Yemen achieved in that moment was to force the world into reflection on the limits of American protection, on the vulnerabilities of Israeli defenses, on the fragility of alliances built on assumptions of superiority, and reflection in geopolitics is the precursor to change. That is why this event matters not just for the Middle East, but for the entire world. It has opened a door to a new strategic landscape, one where no power can afford to take its dominance for granted. When Yemeni drones struck deep inside Israel with remarkable accuracy, the story was not confined to the battlefield. It was also an economic story, a strategic story, and one that shook confidence far beyond the immediate conflict zone. Because in today's interconnected world, every act of war carries with it consequences that ripple through markets, through industries, and through the delicate web of global alliances. And this is where the real weight of these strikes begins to show, not only in physical damage, but in the erosion of economic stability and strategic trust. The first hook to grasp is this: weapons do not just destroy buildings, they destroy confidence. Investors, corporations, and governments all operate on a fragile belief in predictability. When drones reach their targets in a region thought to be under one of the tightest security umbrellas in the world, that predictability is shattered. Markets take notice, oil prices tremble, insurance costs rise, trade routes are questioned, and in a global economy that already teeters on uncertainty, such shocks can have consequences far beyond their immediate impact. Think for a moment about Israel's defense industry. For decades, it has been marketed globally as one of the best in the world, a brand built on the idea of security through superiority. Countries from Europe to Asia have bought into Israeli defense systems, convinced that they were investing in technologies tested and proven under real combat conditions. But what happens when those very systems are exposed as penetrable by low-cost Yemeni drones? That is not just a military embarrassment, it is a commercial crisis. Buyers begin to ask, are these systems worth the billions we are paying? Governments reconsider contracts. Rival defense producers see an opening to challenge Israel's dominance in the arms market. In an industry where perception is profit, the perception of vulnerability is devastating. And let us not forget the American role here. Washington has poured billions into Israel's defense architecture, both in direct aid and in joint technological ventures. The Yemeni breakthrough raises uncomfortable questions for U.S. defense contractors as well. If these billion-dollar projects cannot guarantee protection, then what does that mean for the Pentagon's global sales pitch to its allies? What does it mean for the credibility of American-made weapon systems, often advertised as the backbone of global security? The shock is not limited to Israel. It extends directly into the heart of U.S. defense economics. Now look at the broader regional economy. Every drone strike in the Middle East reverberates through the oil market. Even the perception of instability in key shipping lanes or energy hubs is enough to trigger price volatility. Yemen's ability to strike deep inside Israel forces traders, companies, and governments to reassess risk. Higher risk translates into higher costs, whether in oil premiums, transport insurance, or defense spending. And who ultimately pays those costs? Ordinary citizens, through higher prices at the pump, increased taxes, and reduced public services as governments divert funds to security. Here lies another hook. War is no longer contained to the battlefield. It seeps into your wallet, your paycheck, your daily life. You may not see the drone in the sky, but you feel its impact in the price of bread, in the cost of electricity, in the instability of your pension fund. That is the hidden hand of conflict in a globalized economy. Strategically, these strikes also force nations to reconsider their alliances and dependencies. If Israel, long considered the fortress of security in the Middle East, can be breached, then allies who relied on its protection must question their own safety. Regional powers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, already vulnerable to similar drone technologies, are compelled to rethink their strategies. Do they double down on U.S. systems that may no longer inspire confidence? Do they diversify toward Russian or Chinese technology? Or do they invest in their own domestic industries, sparking an arms race in drone innovation? Each choice carries immense strategic and economic weight, reshaping alliances and shifting balances of power. This is the essence of the Yemeni drone strikes. Their impact is not just measured in explosions, but in the invisible tremors they send across the world economy and geopolitical map. They reveal the fragility of systems we thought were secure, the vulnerability of industries we thought were untouchable, and the interconnection of global markets that means no conflict is ever truly local anymore. And that realization for investors, policymakers, and ordinary citizens alike is more unsettling than any explosion. When pilots in uniform, representing the very core of a nation's defense and security, are handcuffed not for disobedience in combat, but for refusing to participate in the transport of weapons to a foreign conflict, it sends shockwaves far beyond the tarmac. This act does not just restrain individuals, it restrains principles, silences dissent, and broadcasts a chilling message about where loyalty is demanded and where conscience is punished. The image of military or civilian pilots shackled for their refusal raises questions that no society can afford to ignore. Who holds the power to compel compliance, and at what cost to democracy, ethics, and freedom of choice? In the court of public opinion, the visual alone creates a seismic shift. Citizens watching such scenes unfold cannot help but wonder whether the nation they believed was built on liberty is inching toward coercion masked as patriotism. This moment becomes more than an isolated incident, it transforms into a symbol, a case study in how dissent is treated when the stakes involve geopolitics, alliances, and the arms trade. The broader public, whether within the United States or across the globe, interprets these handcuffs as a metaphor for suppression. For some, it may ignite outrage, a sense of betrayal that those who refuse to be complicit in fueling conflict are criminalized rather than celebrated for their integrity. For others, it might spark fear, a realization that saying no to a powerful system can come at the cost of one's freedom and career. Every photograph, every headline, every video clip capturing the moment of restraint ripples through the international media, stirring debates in living rooms, on social media, and within diplomatic circles. Suddenly, the act of handcuffing is not just about disciplining a few individuals. It becomes about defining the boundaries of conscience in a democratic society. The psychological impact on the population cannot be overstated. When citizens witness such a confrontation between authority and morality, they are forced to ask themselves difficult questions. Would I have the courage to stand on principle, even if it meant arrest? Is my government protecting democracy or undermining it? These internal debates shift the national narrative, making the issue of foreign policy more personal, more urgent, and more relatable. And here lies the hook, the undeniable magnetism of a story that places ordinary professionals, not politicians or generals, at the center of a global debate. The drama lies not in distant battlefields, but in airport hangars and military bases where human conscience collides with systemic power. Furthermore, international audiences interpret the handcuffing through their own political lenses. Allies may view it as a dangerous sign of internal division within the United States, questioning the stability of its commitments abroad. Critics and rivals may seize the image as proof of hypocrisy, arguing that America champions freedom of speech and conscience abroad while punishing dissent at home. Neutral observers may see it as a sobering lesson in the complexities of democracy, where ideals of liberty clash with the realities of global power politics. Regardless of the perspective, one fact is inescapable: the handcuffing of pilots is not just a disciplinary measure, it is a global spectacle shaping the narrative of American power and credibility. This spectacle also creates opportunities for grassroots movements, human rights organizations, and anti-war activists to amplify their message. The story of the handcuffed pilots can be mobilized as a rallying cry, a tangible example of resistance and repression. Protest slogans, viral hashtags, and impassioned speeches gain traction not because of abstract policy debates, but because of a concrete, human story: pilots who chose conscience over compliance. In the modern media ecosystem, where narratives travel at lightning speed, such moments can define entire movements. And therein lies the paradox: in trying to silence dissent through force, authorities may unintentionally elevate the dissenters to the status of heroes, martyrs of principle in the eyes of the public, the act of restraint becomes an act of exposure, peeling back the layers of political maneuvering to reveal the stark reality of power dynamics. It is not the handcuffs themselves, but what they represent: control versus conscience, compliance versus courage, that will linger in the minds of people long after the news cycle moves on. The question now is whether this moment becomes a fleeting controversy or a turning point in how citizens and nations confront the morality of war. Let me close with this thought. What happened when those drones struck was more than a military success. It was a wake-up call. A wake-up call for governments who believe that technology alone will protect them. A wake-up call for policymakers who underestimate the will of the oppressed. And a wake-up call for all of us to realize that the 21st century is not going to be defined by superpowers alone. It will be defined by the ingenuity of the small, the desperate, and the underestimated. That is the lesson, and it is one we cannot afford to ignore.